Executive Director of the Glen Park Partnership for Arts and Culture, and I'm really delighted that everyone came today to enjoy this great lecture by Jim Sanborn. Jim Sanborn is here with the cooperation of the Marcia Matejka Gallery, which represents him, so I want to thank them for being involved and being a part of it, and of course thank Jim for making himself available for both the exhibition and for this talk. Now I'd like you to join me in welcoming artist Jim Sanborn.
This is for knuckles. Cell phones and sleepers, that kind of thing. We could probably turn the lights down. That would be great. I was very fortunate growing up in Washington and having a father who was the Library of Congress's chief exhibitionist. And I say that he was the director of exhibitions at the Library of Congress for 30 years. And I followed in his footsteps in most respects. In that a lot of the artwork that I do, I more or less, I do sculpture, but I also put on exhibitions of my sculpture, and I also put on exhibitions of objects which a lot of people don't consider to be art, but as far as I'm concerned, that's fine and that's okay. After, I also had the run of the Library of Congress as a child and could run all through the stacks and learn as much as I wanted to learn, and also understand what exhibitions were about. One of my lasting images was seeing my dad handcuffed. Not everybody can see their father handcuffed in a good way. He was handcuffed to the Gutenberg Bible as it was being transferred from Washington, D.C. to the Metropolitan in New York for an exhibition. I also was able to handle, these days it doesn't happen, the Dead Sea Scrolls, in order to make a high school paper about them. That doesn't often happen either. So, you see, there were some advantages that I had. And then one of the great advantages was when I came to the park. And the thing about the park was, one of the major things that happened was that myself and Rhea Venorcha put together a program for obtaining surplus materials from the U.S. government and the GSA. And basically, it made me into a constructivist. It changed a lot of the artists that were here because all of a sudden you had this gigantic cornucopia of every imaginable material. We could have brought spacecraft to the park if we wanted to work with the spacecraft. We didn't at the time. I would now, but we didn't at the time. So we had this huge amount of material, and with the foundry, we were melting down, ships' propellers. We were, sawing up large. I had tractor trailer loads of aluminum brought to the park and cut up into large public constructivist sculptures, which I dragged out to the green lawn at Geico with my truck, unloaded them on a Sunday afternoon, photographed them very quickly. The security guards come running out. I throw them back on the truck and take off. So that's how I started public art. And I did that more than once to more than several companies around the area. But that public art and myself have had an interesting involvement. It really started here because I had all of these free materials. And then public art has basically supported me since I left the park and supported the kinds of installations that I do and the kind of work that I do, which is virtually unsaleable. I mean, a lot of it's very unsaleable. But the public art has helped move that along. So anyway, the slides that I'm showing you begin in about 1982. And following in that whole vein of working with museum pieces, this is one of the first shows that I did, and it's an Egyptian mummy that I borrowed from a museum in Richmond and then showed at the Virginia Museum. And so I remember carrying her around at 2 o'clock in the morning in the museum under my arm like a piece of wood. And at one point her hand fell off, her ear fell off, and I wired them back together and then put them on this platform more or less as a presentation. And the piece was called Invisible Forces in the Quest I think it was. And so it was, in her case, it was a quest for everlasting life and the tree of life and all of these kinds of things. But it was one of my first installations. But again, it was mysterious in that what I did is I strung very thin monofilament all the way across this installation, which was in an alcove. And so it was a dark room and it was lit in just the right way, so that when most museums don't present objects just right out there, right? In the Virginia Museum, you have to look through these windows and peer down in this tomb way down in the bowels of the museum to see an Egyptian mummy. I wanted to present it right there. But I couldn't very well do that because it's such a valuable object, so I strung super thin monofilament so that when you walked up to it, you felt you were hit in the face with a spider web. Much like Howard Carter might have been hit in the face with a spider web as he opened King Tut's tomb. So that's sort of the idea behind the piece. It was there, but still untouchable and mysterious. Now, this is a mountaintop in southern Utah. And this black stone here, this guy right here, during storms for decades was hit by lightning repeatedly because it's iron ore and because it's called a lodestone. Lodestones are naturally magnetic stones. In the 1970s, I constructed this materials from Glen. In the 1980s, I generally worked with lodestones and natural materials, stone and things like this, and made tableaus about magnetism and the Earth's magnetic force. So I collected these lodestones. I hooked this whole area was owned by a big iron mine in Utah, and it was just about getting ready they were going to lop the top off of this mountain. So just before that, I attached these stones to bulldozers and then dragged them down the mountain, put them on a truck, and brought them back to my studio and started working with lodestones for most of my pieces. This piece sort of tells the story of a lodestone. And this is a shelf of some red slate at the top. And there's a very thin crack in the red slate. And this whole piece is lit by one light source, a single light source. And so the crack, which I could adjust by sliding tiny pieces of stone in, could create this lightning bolt, which, if the slate is ground level, the lightning came through the ground, through the geological layers, and hit the lodestone in the ground and magnetized it and gave it special properties. As you probably know, lodestones were used by the Chinese in order for the Chinese geomancer to predict the future of an emperor. The Chinese would spin a spoon on a table that was made out of a lodestone, and only the geomancer or the shaman would know that the spoon would always point north and south, so he could rotate the board and trick the emperor and make the emperor believe anything he wanted, because he could spin the lodestone and make things work. And so lodestones have very magic powers, and so all through the 1980s, I did a lot of pieces using lodestones. This is a piece that I did in New York, and this is an array of compass dials the compass dials on this side of the room are all arrayed north and south of the Earth's magnetic field, and the compasses on this side are all arrayed in being controlled by lodestones. The only wrinkle in here was that there was an elevator behind this wall, and every time the elevator went past, all these compass dials rotated around, which is sort of interesting and very interactive relative to the building, which is kind of nice. But another interesting thing about lodestones, early African cultures, some of them in the Congo, had these mountaintop retorts, and they put these large columns of lodestone on either side, and they were the first metal detectors. So somebody walked in with a spear, and the spear would get stuck to the lodestone, and they would know that that person was armed, and that would take the spear away. So it was a very interesting thing about lodestones. So I studied lodestones extensively for a fairly long period of time. And then again, this piece, which was actually at the Hirshhorn, I took a compass needle, a regular compass needle, and I polished the front of it, and I wrinkled it a little bit, and then put a very powerful light on it. So symbolically, this line means everything above here is above ground, and this is the horizon line, and everything below here is below ground. And so basically what I ended up with this powerful light is little lightning bolts here. And as the compasses moved in the eddies and currents of the air, these little lightning bolts would move all along the wall as shadow. And these are lodestones that were suspended by monofilaments, which became a nightmare in the museum because I had to go in every day and adjust the height because they kept stretching. Every night going back and forth, making these things that were all the same plane. But it was a fun piece. And again, this is to hit you over the head, but it's a lightning bolt striking the lodestone because of its magic powers. This is, in speaking of magic powers, now we have real science, we have pseudoscience, we have a lot of things. This is one of Virginia's finest dowsers. And this fellow is plying his trade. These are his dowsing rods. He has your basic fork stick in his pocket, and this is what he calls his dowsing cap, which he always takes with him so that he can more or less tell you where your water is or where it isn't. And so this whole pseudoscience started creeping into my true science, and I did a piece like this, which is called All Things Turned to Stone. And so these are basically dowsing rods. And inside, what I did is I drilled a very thin hole all the way through this stick, and I inserted a steel rod, a magnetic steel rod, inside each one of these. And so basically all these are suspended from one point and are moving very slightly back and forth in the air, but they all orient themselves north and south. So anytime this was shown in the museum, it had to be oriented in such a way that that was north and this was south. So this is a tree that was broken off in a violent storm, and all of these objects here had turned to stone. So basically, All Things Had Turned to Stone was many different references, but since dowsers are looking for water, we have a fossilized seabed here that's about 200 million years old, and a piece of quartz that resembles ice. And so that was hence the title, All Things Turned to Stone. And then this is another piece. This was actually at the Phillips collection here in DC, and it was an installation, again, using fossils. Now, I borrowed these fossils from the National Museum of American History, installed them at the Phillips collection, and then they're installed in a very large bed of a fossilized seabed that I got in Utah, brought back and installed at the Phillips collection. And inside here, under here, there is a pool of water with a vortex generator in it. So I generated a vortex that was always moving, a whirlpool in here, and I had a light inside here that projected the moving whirlpool on the wall behind it. And so I always felt as if there was some connection, like at the bottom of the ocean you have these ammonites, which are curled in such a way, and perhaps a whirlpool came down and touched that ammonite, and then you go up to the surface of the ocean, and all of a sudden it turns into a water spout. And the water spout goes up into the sky, and above the sky you end up with spiral nebula. So there's this sort of continuum that went from spiral nebulas all the way down to ammonites, and that was the kind of thing I was trying to study. Was that sort of overlapping, all of those sort of overlapping feelings about what natural things are and how they operate. I'm moving the screen by hitting this little leg here, sorry about that. This is a piece along the same vein. This is in Silver Spring, Maryland, and this is a recreation. This is in front of a museum for NOAA, and it's a recreation of the Maine coastline. And so I rented boats, and I went to Maine, and I went on the coastline, and went out to sea, and photographed coastlines until I could find a coastline that I really wanted to use. Then I spent about a year of research and built a model of this commission, a working model that was about 16 feet long. And so a wave is propagated in this teacup of water. You can't have a pool of water any deeper than 32 inches, otherwise you have to have a lifeguard. Now that would look kind of very stupid. So basically I did it without the lifeguard, 32 inches of water. I was able to make waves that were 12 feet high. So that was kind of remarkable in that they crash against here and splash all over the place. The piece is still operating. It's operating at about a third of what it's capable of operating at because people are getting wet. So, that's pretty tedious. But you can sit here at lunch and close your eyes and really imagine that you're at the ocean, which was really the point of doing what I did.